July 1924. Mount St. Helens, Washington State. In history, there are some events that tread the line of both folklore and truth. Often these events are garbled messes of he said, she said, and accounts of things with no true evidence to back them up. However, in 1924, one of these events would occur, and unlike what I just mentioned, this is a story about a group of 5 men who found themselves trapped in the middle of the woods inside a quaint little cabin. On that summer night in 1924, these men would be attacked by a group of unknown, hairy, ape-like beasts who terrorized them for the whole night. Rocks being thrown from the top of ridgelines at their cabin, gunshots ringing out in the quiet night sky of Washington, and with evidence seemingly being left behind of whatever attacking them not just being a figment of their imagination. Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we examine a historic Bigfoot encounter, one rooted in stories, folklore, and local papers. One in which perhaps to this day we have not fully been able to explain, and one in which perhaps shows us there is more out there that we truly don't know about. Today we explore the infamous 1924 Ape Canyon Incident. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you're listening to this show, I first want to say thank you for checking out the show, checking out my content. I greatly appreciate it. If you've already made it here, you might as well check out all the other videos that I have here, whether you're listening to this on Spotify or YouTube. Please check out all my other episodes as well. It helps me out a lot, and I appreciate it. But with that being said, if you are taking a listen to this episode on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I publish a new episode. As well, if you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out greatly, and I appreciate the heck out of it. Feel free while you're here as well to follow me on both of my social medias. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Unblurring the Unknown as well. Now, today on the show, we have a fascinating tale that lodges itself within cryptid history as well as the Bigfoot subgenre. Now, before the infamous Patterson film that put the Bigfoot legend on the map and perhaps making the creature synonymous with Northern California and the Pacific Northwest, you had what happened at Ape Canyon. Now, I've heard of this event for a very long time, however, I had not done extensive research into what happened into this case until this episode. Sure, I knew the premise, but not the details, so I love researching them for you on this week's episode. Now, with that being said, I mentioned it on the last episode that I have not really covered Bigfoot at all here in the show, and that I vowed to change that, so I wanted to come right out of the gate and dive into a pretty famous event that I don't think many people know about. But with that all being said, how today's episode is going to work is that we're going to dive into the events of what happened that July night in 1924 and what the men encountered, and then dive into the subsequent investigations done into these claims and what was uncovered, and then at the very end, we will wrap it all up with my own personal theory and our collection of theories about what happened at Ape Canyon. But without further ado, let's dive into it. Now, anyone who has knowledge on Bigfoot knows that for as long as we've had recorded history from the Native American peoples that once lived in droves throughout many of the modern states we have now, Bigfoot was a legend that got its start there. Many tribespeople had their own stories of quote-unquote wild men who stalked the woods. Sometimes being reclusive in nature and sometimes more spiteful and aggressive towards the native peoples and their children, while the history of Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, is deeply rooted within many Native American cultures, it is those from the British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest that detail accounts of what many would consider the modern-day Bigfoot. However, those legends are of course not only focused to those tribes. Tribes all across the country either have their own variation in some regard, or another similar creature that they spread folklore and legend about. Now, in fact, the name Sasquatch is widely believed to have originated from a Coast Salish tribal word, Saskets, which translates to wild man. Many Native American tribes looked upon Bigfoot or Sasquatch as this protector of the woods, and that they were not to be feared but rather respected. Other legends speak of them inhabiting another plane of existence entirely, and that the existence of Bigfoot is like an omen, or perhaps a silent watcher from the woods. No matter what you might believe when it comes to Bigfoot or Sasquatch, the idea of the creature's existence is nothing new. However, in 1924, Bigfoot was certainly not a mainstream idea like it is today. For a fact, the term Bigfoot did not even exist until 1958, when it was listed as a term in the newspaper in regards to a set of footprints found by Jerry Crew and his logging crew in Humboldt County, California. Now, we could go into the in-depth history of Bigfoot, but that in and of itself could be its own episode, so I will save that for some time down the road. However, pre-1924, you did have some stories of what people would describe as wild men. In 1847, author Paul Kane wrote stories that he heard about the Skookums, a race of wild men spoken about in the native peoples around the area of Mount St. Helens in Washington. While the idea of Bigfoot was not popularized, the stories of wild men in the mountains were sometimes spread about through story and legend. Now, before we dive into the story, it is important to note that there are different variations of this story, and some of them vary in the details and in the order in which the events happened, and kind of the reason for this is mostly due to time taking its toll on these stories, and the stories themselves then being taken and retold in slightly different ways and variations. Now, just in my research for this episode alone, I found multiple different renditions of how this story was told, so I'm just going to try my best to be as accurate as I possibly can be with the information that I was able to uncover and the information that I had available to me out there on the World Wide Web. Now, our story starts in July of 1924. 5 men would venture into the woods and hills surrounding Mount St. Helens in search of gold. They were prospectors, and during this time, gold mining was a risky but profitable business, and it was not uncommon for prospectors to head out into the hills in search of gold. Now, these 5 men, Marion Smith, who was the leader of the group, Leroy Smith, his son, who I found in some sources as just going by Roy. Then you also had Fred Beck, Gabe Lefevre, if I pronounced his name right, and John Peterson. While these men would mine in the forest and mountains, they would have built a pretty basic cabin up in the mountains around Mount St. Helens and the hills around Mount St. Helens during prior trips that they had taken up there. Now, it was pretty basic, but it was pretty much just a place to sleep at during the night while they mined out in the woods during the daytime. Now, this cabin would be in the area that would later become known as Ape Canyon. However, of course, it was not called this back during 1924, but after this event, it would be. Now, as these 5 men would venture deeper into the woods into an area they had not mined yet, they couldn't help but shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the 5 men moved along the base of the mountain in a narrow ravine up ahead, they could make out the presence of 4 massive figures that they could not identify. The creatures were estimated to be as tall as the doorway to a house, so roughly 7 to 8 feet tall, and weighing roughly 400 pounds. Their bodies in thick fur, and their movement was bipedal and human-like, but also very ape-like as well. Now, as the 4 creatures stood still in front of the miners, one of these creatures would let out a loud holler into the ravine and forest. One of the miners, Fred Beck, instead of fleeing, raised his gun and fired a shot. The creature kept moving towards the men, and Beck continued to fire his rifle. After 4 shots, the beast finally fell, and it collapsed down into the ravine. At this point, the other 3 creatures were furious and erupted with screams. Now, in some sources that I did find, they claimed that this event, Fred Beck shooting one of these wild men, one of these ape creatures, actually happened later in the story, versus other sources that I saw happened before what would take place in the middle of the night at the cabin. So this is one of these kind of vague areas and parts of the story, that have kind of been lost to time to a certain degree in terms of the order in which they happened. However, take this entire timeline with a grain of salt. We know based off of the stories that they told about Ape Canyon that these events all occurred. The manner in which they occurred is kind of up for debate a little bit. Now, at this point, the miners would flee and run away and try to make it back to their cabin by any means possible. As they fled, they would watch the shadows of more creatures emerge from the woods and caves all throughout the mountain valley. As the men got back inside, they were scared beyond belief, and they couldn't sleep as the woods grew silent outside of the cabin, unsure of what they encountered out there in the woods. Could it have been these wild men that legend perhaps spoke of? Or perhaps was it something else entirely? I can only imagine where their state of mind was when they got back into their cabin that night. Now, later on that night is when they would be attacked. A large thud would be heard outside against the side of the cabin, followed by another and another. The sounds of hoots and hollers coming from outside of the cabin. Now, it was clear that the cabin was being pelted by logs and rocks and debris by something, and by process of elimination, the miners thought that it could have been these creatures coming back. The men readied their weapons inside of the cabin, and one of these creatures would actually try to force its way inside of the cabin and try to push the front door open, and its arm would actually sneak through the side of the door. Now, one of the men, would grab an axe and swing it at the creature's arm, and it would strike the creature, and the creature would yell out in pain and would actually retract its arm out of the doorway. Now, more rocks and boulders would be thrown from the rock outcroppings and hills above, as rocks would start to make their way in through the damaged roof. One rock would actually hit Fred Beck right on the head, knocking him unconscious. Now again, details of this attack are foggy at best, and some sources I looked into stated different recollections of what happened that night. However, again, it seems like the events remain the same. Now, in some sources I found, they stated that the creature itself reached in through the door and tried to grab an axe that was inside the cabin, and other sources I read said that one of the miners actually picked up the axe and swung it at the Bigfoot's arm, or ape creature, whatever you want to call it, to get it to basically get out of the cabin, to stop pushing on the door and stop trying to break in. So there's multiple different variations to this story, and I just kind of want to reiterate that, and of course this is all going to come back up into theories and everything like that. However, for nearly 2 hours, the men shot and fired their weapons wildly at the creatures outside. Boulders and logs slammed against the roof and walls of the cabin, as wood splintered from the ceiling and walls, as the cabin was relentlessly battered. As Fred Beck lay motionless still on the cabin floor, the other men fought on all night until the sunrise came and the creatures seemingly vanished. The attack had occurred over the following hours, had seemingly come to an abrupt end, almost as quickly as the attack started. The men would emerge from the dilapidated cabin, their clothes torn, bodies bruised, and labored from the cabin in the woods and then back down to the town of Kelso, Washington. Now, the miners did not care about what they left behind in the cabin or in the woods. Now, it is rumored that the men left behind valuable mining equipment and rations of food, which would, of course, be valuable to the men or others, and they instead of decided to just get the hell out of there entirely, and I can't really blame them. When arriving back into town in Kelso, it did not take long for the word of what happened on the mountain to make its rounds all throughout the town. Although the men at first decided that it was within their best interest to keep this story private, it wouldn't stay that way for long, not very long at all, and soon the rumors of the quote-unquote Battle of Ape Canyon would circle the town of Kelso, and reporters would be eager to get a piece of the story about what happened out in the mountains that night. Now, eventually, this story of the men being attacked by these ape creatures in the middle of the night would reach two park rangers named J.H. Huffman and Bill Welch. The rangers wanted to travel back to the cabin themselves to see proof of what transpired, to see if the miner's story was genuine or perhaps just hogwash. The two rangers would travel back to the site of the encounter with Fred Beck, and they first went to the canyon itself, where the first creature was reportedly shot and killed. Now, whether or not the other men went with Beck is unclear, but we do know that Beck did take the rangers up the mountain. However, upon investigation, no body of the creature could be recovered, and at the site of the cabin, the damage to the building was definite. Spent shell casings were strewn about, and the roof was on the brink of collapsing, and looked like it had been smashed in repeatedly. Large rocks were found inside on the cabin floor, and outside of the cabin, large footprints were actually left behind in the dirt around the house. Now, the rangers would take casts of these footprints that were found outside of the cabin, and they would be extremely skeptical of these footprints found and stated that there could have been a way for the miners, these men, to fake these footprints by using the human hand and different kind of versions of kind of pressing down your knuckles into the dirt. And J.H. Huffman, the first park ranger, used a combination of his palm and knuckles to make a basically pseudo track to say, like, hey, we don't believe you, we think this is a fake, and XYZ. Now, there is a supposed photo of these footprint tracks that were recovered, and why I am not sure if I want to buy onto the hoax train just yet. The footprints are definitely strange, and I do encourage everybody to go online and take a look at them. If you just Google 1924 Ape Canyon Bigfoot track, it should pop right up. I saw it. And they are very strange. And if you know anything about Bigfoot, or if you've seen Bigfoot casts before, these ones are a little bit different. It seems like the toes wrap kind of around the edge of the foot, as opposed to kind of 5 toes right on the front of the foot, like a traditional, supposed Bigfoot track or footprint. Now, of course, regardless of the park rangers going up there, this story did a number in the local papers, and they all started carrying the story about what happened that night on the mountain, again, regardless of how the park rangers felt about the story being made up. And this all would kind of add to the lore about Ape Canyon and the stories of wild men that lived up in the mountains. Now, this story would fade into legend and become front page news, however, again in the 1950s. Now, in the 1950s, the Seattle Times published an article claiming that several members of a YMCA group had staged the attack on the men in the cabin, and that they decided to play a prank on them. Now, as this article goes, and as this claim by the YMCA group goes, says that they positioned themselves on the ridgeline above the cabin and hurled rocks down the banks and into the cabin below, and created a plethora of hoots and hollers to try to scare the miners in basically some kind of prank. However, it's kind of a sick prank. I don't know anybody who would do that, but I guess different animal back in the 1920s, I guess. However, on the surface, this claim of the YMCA group basically pranking the miners might seem plausible. It does not take into effect the elements of the story that we do have. It does not take into effect the footprints, whether fake or not. This would imply that the YMCA students would have made the footprints themselves, which I don't know if they would have been able to get that close to the cabin without possibly being shot by one of these miners. And then you also have the miners claiming to see the creatures before the attack and claiming to shoot and kill one. Now, you also have the tidbit of information with one creature sticking its arm through the door of the cabin as well. However, in my opinion, there's too many details of this that just do not check out with me. Now, if anything, this seems like a 1950s version of clickbait, where these kids or YMCA staff members, whoever they were, tried to steer the story towards them for some reason. Now, again, I am not picking sides yet on whether or not this is a hoax or not, so I will circle back to this at the end. However, I thoroughly don't believe this claim. Now, another rumor that kind of made its way around in regards to this entire story was that the miners were drinking heavily that night, and while they were staying at the cabin, skeptics think that they could have been so drunk that they could have made up this entire story in some type of drunken disorientation, and then the story then spread and took on a life of its own once they got back into Kelso. However, again, this claim needs more meat on it for it to check all the boxes, in my personal opinion. But some have roped this theory of kind of drunken disorder into the YMCA story and stated that if the men were wildly intoxicated, perhaps they could have interpreted this prank as being attacked by wild men. However, that is merely just a theory. Now, in the years that followed, the 5 men who spoke upon the event have remained remarkably consistent, with only minor details maybe changing from story to story. Now, all of these men tell very similar stories about the battle that they all underwent that summer night. Now, Fred Beck's opinion on what attacked them that night and their origins has changed with time. For a while, he thought they were a flesh and blood creature that was stalking the woods of the Pacific Northwest. And instead, in the 60s and 70s, in interviews, Fred Beck would change his opinion and state that he felt these beasts were not creatures of this world, but rather some type of interdimensional being, and that the Sasquatch, Yeti, and even the Yowie of Australia were all related and were basically on the same dimensional plane of existence. Now, that might be extremely far-fetched, however, it is not the first time I have heard of the interdimensional Bigfoot theory, and that theory itself could be something that I explore in a future episode. However, when it comes to the story of the Battle of Ape Canyon, this is not where the story ends. Our story continues with a man named Mark Meersel. Now, Mark Meersel is a researcher, and ever since the age of 8, he has been fascinated with what occurred at Ape Canyon in 1924. As he grew up in age, his fascination grew into obsession, and growing up in the Pacific Northwest, the event was kind of etched in Bigfoot lore. He took it upon himself to discover the truth about what happened at Ape Canyon. Now, Meersel instantly took to finding as much information that he could about the incident itself, and to be honest, he did not find much. Even though stories hit the newspapers hard, current information was hard to come by, so he took it one step further and was able to track down relatives of the miners who were attacked that night. Now, Meersel was able to track down Betty Mitchell, who would be the daughter of Leroy Smith, and she stated that she had heard about the story and heard about the Battle of Ape Canyon before, but had no idea her dad was even attached to the story or even involved with it, or that he was even up on the mountain that night. However, according to Meersel, Leroy Smith stated that he did not want anything to do with whatever they encountered in the mountains again that night, and that whatever it was shook him to the core enough that he didn't want to talk about it ever again. Meersel also found out that the mine the men were using had been very lucrative for them, so this would kind of cast doubt into the whole idea that this was a hoax. When Meersel found out that the mine was very lucrative, and the miners personally chose not to ever return to the site of the mine or the cabin again. Now, some would actually return by themselves, like Fred Beck with the forest rangers, but by all accounts, these 5 men would completely abandon the mine that they were creating a very lucrative profit off of and never return back to the area of Ape Canyon alone. Now, in Meersel's research and even digging, he found out that the cabin was believed to be lost, and that even Fred Beck himself thought it burned down, and stated that in a book Beck would later go on to write. Now, Meersel didn't think the cabin was entirely lost, so he set out to try and find where the cabin actually was, and as it turns out, the area that the cabin was supposed to reside was never ever commercially logged or affected by the eruption of Mount St. Helens either. So seemingly, it should have been spared, and it should exist in some capacity. This gave Meersel hope, and Meersel searched and searched, however, for the longest time, he could not find it. In his investigations into the mountains looking for the cabin, Meersel stated that he and some of his friends, helping him with the search of this cabin, heard strange noises that they could not explain. Meersel compared it to some strange type of gibberish that they could not make out, and that he had never heard something like it before. Now, after an undetermined amount of time searching, in 2013, Mark Meersel would find it, or what was left of it. They found rotting stumps, a clue that they were given about the cabin's location back when they started searching and broke out the metal detector. They were able to find the foundation of where the cabin used to lay, as well as spent .30-30 shell casings. The discovery of the shell casings is significant, as it matches the caliber of the gun used by one of the miners in the Battle of Ape Canyon. Now, while the discovery was significant, the lack of physical evidence being left behind that connects to the actual battle itself makes it hard to tell whether or not the men had a full-on battle with a troop of Sasquatch that night. But Meersel remains convinced that something must have happened on that mountain that shook them to their core enough to be hush-hush about the incident, in addition to leaving behind a valuable and lucrative mine in the mountains. Now, the Mitchell family would be able to later discover the mine used by Leroy Smith and the other miners in 2023. Now, unfortunately, there would be no presence of any wild, hairy ape-men that, of course, they could not find. However, while the Mitchell family was excited to learn some of their family history in connection with this mine and in connection with the Battle of Ape Canyon, what truly happened at Ape Canyon will seemingly still remain a mystery. And with that being said, that kind of leads us right into our theories section for today's episode. Now, our first theory I want to dive into is that Ape Canyon and the attack at Ape Canyon was real. Now, again, the first theory I want to go over here is that the idea that this attack was real, and that whatever the men encountered was some type of bona fide creature, whether that be Bigfoot, or perhaps some type of wild man humanoid, or perhaps prehistoric ancestor of humans that has seemingly survived the test of time itself. Now, Mount St. Helens itself is no stranger to Bigfoot or wild man claims, and even mysteries itself. It has a history of people seemingly vanishing into thin air, perhaps most notable being the case of Jim Carter, who had vanished from thin air after from a hiking party near where Ape Canyon is located in 1950. Now, to this day, Carter has never been found, and what was left behind of evidence was his ski tracks, frantically heading down the steep slope of the canyon below, almost like he was running away from something. Now, this idea in this story of Jim Carter vanishing from Mount St. Helens and vanishing near basically the location of where Ape Canyon is, has been roped in with the Ape Canyon attack because of its proximity and its strangeness. Now, whether or not Jim Carter succumbed to a wild man, like what attacked the miners in 1924, remains a total mystery, but it adds to the lore surrounding this place in general. When it comes to this story being real, it has some things helping it. The physical description of the cabin, the existence of so-called physical evidence of the footprints, the spent shell casings, and multiple eyewitnesses, as well as this being seemingly corroborated between the 5 men over decades of time. Now, you also have the idea of Bigfoot being a relatively new phenomenon. After all, the Bigfoot moniker wouldn't be adopted until the 50s, so this case has a lot going for it to potentially be real, albeit maybe a little far-fetched to some. Now, the next theory I want to go over is that perhaps this was some type of made-up hoax by drunk miners. Now, the second most plausible theory is that this was made up by the miners in some sort of hoax for attention to perhaps, maybe a hoax to hide their lucrative mine away from other potential prospectors in the mountains. Now, this one on the surface seems plausible. Perhaps these 5 men get the idea to hatch this plan based off of old Native American legend and stage an attack by wild people in the woods to scare off potential competition. However, the fact that these 5 men stuck to their stories for so long, and that even some members of the family kept it quiet for so long, makes me very doubtful of this. And if the statement is true that they indeed left the mine after this attack and never returned, and that they would have to keep the knowledge of them, stumbling upon this lucrative mine a secret, and that this entire thing was staged, just seems very odd to me. If you were staging this attack, or if you were trying to stage something to get, perhaps other prospectors, other miners away from your area to scare them, these men, by all accounts, from what Mark Mearsell was able to discover, they didn't return to this area. So if this in fact was a hoax that they made up to help disguise their mine and how much money they were making off this mine, why didn't the men go back? And this idea that the men didn't go back, again, this seems to be kind of secondhand through what Mearsell was able to find, that they were so scared and so shocked about what they saw in the woods that night and what they were attacked by, that they did not want to go up into those woods ever again, and they wanted nothing to do with it. And that seemingly is restated by Leroy Smith as well. Now, the miners could have faked the footprints, yes, but the fact that none of these 5 men spilled the beans to either their extended family or friends that we know of, and stuck by the story to newspapers and to the families that did know, makes me think that whatever they saw genuinely scared them to the point that they did not want to go back to this area at all. Now, it is also possible that they were in some type of drunken state in which they framed this attack, but then they would have to have been so drunk to a point of incoherence to mistake what they described, as Bigfoot, to mistake that as being a bear or something else entirely and twist the story inadvertently. So whether hoax or misidentification through intoxication, both leave more questions than answers, in my personal opinion. Now, this last little sub-theory I have is that the YMCA, and being that these YMCA kids did it, or whoever they were from the YMCA, they did it and they pranked these drunken miners. Now, while I do like this theory, it took them roughly 30 years to come forward with these claims, and however they kind of do explain, what the miners claim to have seen with like the rocks and the logs being thrown down in the cabin. It does not explain the creature that they reportedly shot. It does not explain the footprints or the hairy arm coming through the cabin door. Now again, like I said, it could explain the rocks, but some of these boulders were reportedly of significant size, and the damage to the cabin was significant through all of these stories' retellings. Now, I do not think that this was the work of some nearby camping YMCA kids who tried to play a prank. This could have killed someone, or it could have gotten them killed from the spraying and barrage of bullets coming from inside of the cabin itself from these miners who were clearly scared for their lives. It's dumb, it's stupid, and to me, it's merely an attempt on trying to jump on a story to try to get some front page headlines out of it. Now, in my personal opinion, I like the idea that this story was true, but I also like the idea that perhaps this was a way for these 5 miners to distract others from finding their lucrative mine, like Mearcell claimed it was for them. However, you cannot fake the emotion, you cannot fake the fear, and, sure, you could fake the accounts and some of the claims that they saw something, but again, I think it's significant that these men, by all accounts, by all research that I was able to find, and maybe there's some other research that I was not able to dig up when I was looking around for information for this week's episode, by all accounts, they were petrified. They were scared, they were shocked, whatever it was that they saw something. Now again, could it be possible that these 5 miners were drunk and they were genuinely scared of something in the woods, but it definitely wasn't Bigfoot? That's very much a possibility as well. However, again, you do have the footprints playing into account here, and if you want to go with the idea that perhaps, they made the footprints themselves, this was disproven by Huffman and Welch, the park rangers. If you want to go that route, sure, I completely understand. If you want to buy that this is a hoax, I understand. However, to me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, the idea of Bigfoot wasn't even really a mainstay in people's minds until the 1950s. Again, you didn't have the 1950s when they rolled around and you had the discovery of basically the first, I guess, not first, but the infamous Bigfoot tracks with what was discovered in Humboldt County, California in the 1950s, and then later in the late 60s, you had the infamous Patterson-Gimlin footage, which, again, is synonymous with Bigfoot now. If you've never watched the Patterson-Gimlin footage, it is probably 110% the best Bigfoot footage out there, and that's crazy considering it came from the 1960s, but I genuinely stand by that, and even that footage itself is hotly debated whether or not it is real or whether it is fake. However, the idea of Bigfoot, and there's the folklore and the legends of wild men in the mountains that were fostered by, these Native American legends and lore and things like that, these weren't necessarily, from what I could find, in my personal opinion, these weren't widely talked about. So these men had to create this story about Bigfoot before Bigfoot was really even a termed phrase. However, I'm kind of going on a rant here about my own personal theory here, and I hope you can bear with me here for a second. But again, I think that something definitely happened up in that mountain. Whatever it was, maybe remains a little bit up for debate. I'm definitely split on the idea of this being a hoax just because of kind of the, I would say, inconsistencies of the story. Again, it did take place in the 1920s, so there is portions of the story that are just not going to hold up for time, and we have a rough timeline of what happened, but it's very, very, very loose. It doesn't have that going for it as well. It does not have elaborate details in that timeline either, so that's kind of a con as well. However, in my personal opinion, there was definitely something that happened up there on the mountain. Clearly, the miners were very shocked. They were very spooked by whatever was up there that they did not want to return, and that, I think, is genuine. However, that is only my personal theory. I think something definitely happened. Whether or not I want to jump onto the train that perhaps I got attacked by a group of wild men or attacked by a group of Bigfoot, I'm not quite sure I want to buy into that. But I'm also not quite sure I want to buy into the idea that this was a hoax either. I think they definitely saw something. Just what it was will perhaps always remain a mystery and perhaps be changed over the decades and decades to follow from now, and hopefully with more information that we find. But again, this happened in the 1920s, so that was 101 years ago, which is crazy to think about. But with that being said, if you have your own personal thoughts and theories about what happened in 1924 and the Ape Canyon Incident, feel free to leave it down to me in the comment section. I'm usually always really good about responding to all your comments in the comment section. Again, it helps me out in the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. But with that being said, that is going to do it for me on this week's episode of the 1924 Ape Canyon Incident. I hope you all enjoyed it. It's kind of my first dipping of the toes of mine into kind of the Bigfoot subgenre. I think anybody who's really known me for quite a long period of time, and I think I stated this in the last episode as well when we talked about the new Remain Bigfoot, was that pretty much ever since I was a kid in middle school, I've been I wouldn't say obsessed. In middle school, I was definitely obsessed with Bigfoot and everything that is it. And of course, as I've become an adult now, and am an adult, my opinions have changed to be a lot more grounded when it comes to these types of things. You see me often take a grounded approach when it comes to theories and all that kind of stuff. But definitely it is something that is not an alien topic to me. Aliens are kind of an alien topic to me. But it's definitely not an alien topic to me. I always have fun when I research it, and I'm kind of surprised it has taken me this long to do an episode over anything Bigfoot related. It's quite a long time. I'm surprised it took me this long, but I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you all enjoyed kind of this little detour and what you might be used to from me in general. But with that being said, again, that is going to do it for this week's episode on the 1924 Ape Canyon Incident. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the next one.